Welcome to the second part of Westminster Open Lens, or Reboot, at the start of the new season. I'm in conversation with John Denham, who's just delivered a short lecture on his contribution to the Spirit of Britain book, and Will Straw, who's been looking at Britain's position in the world. John, your contribution, what you were identifying is that my whole generation, and probably a large part of yours, spent its time worrying about rising rebellion and discontent in Wales and Scotland, finding solutions to that, and took our eye completely off the ball at a rising discontent in England, and that was true across all the political parties, and that then found expression not just in party political upheaval, but specifically in Brexit. So are you basically saying that our entire establishment effort wasn't strategically wrong, but missed completely the uprising and disconnect in England?
Well, I'd actually say it was strategically wrong, in that people didn't understand that what was going on in Wales and Scotland was part of this process of saying, what sort of Britain do we want in a post-imperial age? And actually what the establishment thought was, we can hang on to much of the infrastructure of the imperial unitary state. England has always been run by the UK government. And so if you look back, as I've done, to the Labour government, people thought, well, we'll do a deal for Scotland. Actually, not because they thought Scotland would be better governed. They thought it was a way of getting rid of the SNP. And then you had to do something for Wales. So there was no real proper debate about how you actually want to govern Britain in the future. And secondly, there was a really misguided strategic view, which many Scots and Welsh were responsible for, which said, well, we should have powers, but because England's so big, whatever happens, England should not have an expression of its own, because if England has an expression of its own identity, that will wreck the Union. Well, the great irony of that is it's the fact that no voice was allowed for England that has led to the Brexit vote, amongst other things, but has contributed to the Brexit vote, and actually is now the existential threat to the Union itself. Because of the possibility that with Brexit going badly wrong, the Scots may want to have another chance to break away, the Northern Ireland settlement will come unpicked. So the very attempt to say we shouldn't deal with England in order to save the Union has actually become the thing that's most undermining the Union.
And how much burden for finding a voice for England falls to people like Sadiq Khan or Andy Burnham or Dan Jarvis or Andy Street in Birmingham? You know, is that capable of finding that voice?
I think that's where the debate should come from. You see, England actually needs two things. It needs both its ability to take its own decisions on the same issues like higher education or childcare that Scotland and Wales do, but secondly, it needs devolution. I mean, even if you had, say, some sort of English government and executive and parliament or whatever like those in Wales and Scotland, England would still be the most centralised nation in Europe. So you also have to have devolution. And I think that the creation of elected mayors gives you the potential to start that debate. And the reality is that when it comes to getting power out of Whitehall, Andy Burnham in Manchester and Andy Street in the West Midlands have got more in common than they disagree on. One is Labour, one is Conservative, but actually both are hobbled by the fact that people working within a few minutes of where we're talking in Westminster don't want to give either of them the power to build a roundabout without getting approval from the Department of Transport. And so if we got these directly elected people who largely have symbolic powers at the moment to come together and say we need real power, and so do our local authorities, if you want to say where's the constitutional debate going to come from, I think it's much more likely to come from there than, say, the Labour Party or the Conservative Party in Westminster.
Interesting point, Will, to connect to that point about voice. One of the things that struck me about the terrible events in Manchester, which was a worldwide terrorist event, was that Andy Burnham did find a voice. Manchester suddenly did have a voice. And even though it was quite early in his administration, without much power, he provided a certain amount of cohesion that ended up speaking to the world, not just to the rest of the UK. How do you, the projection, if you think then of Manchester in terms of the Premier League, of its universities, this kind of Manchester's by and large the only other city that overseas students applying to Britain can identify on the map outside London. You know, how do you think that perception either plays in Manchester or plays in the world? You know.
Well, I think the first thing is that it is extraordinary that we're surprised that there should be a mayor of Manchester who comes to embody the response of that city to an awful terrorist attack. When 9/11 took place, nobody was surprised that Rudy Giuliani, then the mayor of New York, led the response. It's because we haven't had civic mayors until very recently that this was a surprise to us. But I mean, I absolutely agree with John of the importance of giving people back a sense of and a real control in their lives by having decisions that affect them taking place much more locally to them. But I think Manchester absolutely plays to the soft power that Britain has. You're absolutely right that the football team and the creative industries that come out of Manchester and much of the entertainment are absolutely critical to how Britain is seen abroad. It isn't just about London, but how wonderful would it be if there were many other poles of the UK in the way that France is not characterised by Paris and America isn't characterised by Washington DC or even New York.
But do you think, you know, if John can find solutions to this English dilemma, and you then have a union of the many parts, that those many parts can create the political will that's required for military action, for you know, participation with the Blue Berets, or do you think we are now in a long period of indecision on those kinds of hard power choices that sometimes may need to be necessary to back up the soft power and development? How is the will created? That seems to be the thread, the connection between the two. John?
Well, I mean, you know, obviously I resigned over the Iraq War, and I think you can't get away from the fact that that has put a serial distrust of what governments ask people to support into the political system, which is going to be there for a very long time to come. Yeah. But I think that if you have a sense of the different parts of the United Kingdom coming together in a reformed union, where you actually have a debate about our purposes and what you want, and where you can articulate the sort of things that Will was talking about, you know, these are the values that we exist to promote, then you've got the best chance of creating a consensus about our role in the world. Really, the problem is that that debate doesn't take place at the moment. I mean, the debate is more one of, I guess, I don't know if you agree, Will, but we don't want anything to do with any of that. We don't want anything to do with aid, because it's expensive. We don't want anything to do with the military, because it wasn't so badly wrong last time. And that is the worst possible situation. And you say, where is that debate taking place? It can't just be in Westminster, because the people of Scotland, the people of Wales, the people of Northern Ireland elect their own politicians, and they will expect them to have a voice in those things. And that's why I come back to the fact that you've got to find the basis of saying, let's refresh the union for the 21st century, so those voices are properly heard.
Yeah. I mean, the Iraq War, there's no doubt, has cast the most extraordinary long shadow over our foreign policy in relation to our defence activities. And people are not only distrustful of the principle of a foreign intervention, but also of the motivation of politicians when they are making a case for intervention. Libya didn't help with that, and as we saw with Syria, there was not a majority of support in the country, and politicians were responsive to that public pressure and didn't vote for it in Parliament. I think the key questions to answer in relation to any humanitarian intervention or a more confrontational intervention are, first of all, what is the national interest? You know, what is at stake for the UK here? How is our security at risk? That is a very important first-order question, which we haven't always got right, and where the evidence has been misused. Secondly, what are our obligations internationally? Principles like the responsibility to protect, and the British sense of fairness, of wanting to help those who are most vulnerable and most in distress. But thirdly, and most importantly, can we do this through international institutions? Can we do this on a undoubtedly legal basis? And I think if you can't answer those three questions, it's very hard to to make the case, and we shouldn't try to.
And we're coming up to the party conference season. The Conservatives are in Birmingham, and they'll undoubtedly make a show of that. Labour is in Liverpool. But do you think either of your issues, whether it's the English dilemma or Britain's place in the world or its role in some hard power action, do you think either of them will get an airing at either conference, or will it all be squeezed out by not just Brexit, but by both party leaderships wanting to avoid these things because actually they don't have anything clear to say on it?
Yeah. I think it'll be mixed in terms of the Labour conference, because on the one hand there are nods towards English identity and those sorts of issues in language about devolution, in proposals for Saints' Days, national holidays, the idea of creating a minister for England. On the other hand, much of the policy language, National Care Service, National Education Service, does sound as though this is retreating back to the Whitehall state. We're going to get into power, we're going to run everything from London, and it will be doing things better than locally. Now, this happened before 1997, and the reason that after 13 years of Labour government, the government of England was unchanged, apart from the Mayor of London. I mean, we had massive constitutional reform, but England was utterly unchanged, was because these same dilemmas, what do we want to do centrally and what do we want to do locally, were fudged ahead of 1997. It was agreed not to answer the question. We're in danger of going to the next election having a language of devolution, but no settled consensus on what we mean to do. And I don't see that finding much space at the Labour conference.
Yeah, foreign policy tends not to have a huge role in party conferences unless there has been an international moment like Iraq very presently. Brexit, of course, stands over both conferences and it is at heart an international issue. It has so many implications for our place in the world and from our ability to spark new alliances. But there is also under the surface quite an interesting debate that's taking place about our policy towards the Middle East within the Labour Party. And the recent row over anti-Semitism, some of the awful remarks that we've seen from Labour Party members, the NEC very belatedly adopting the IHRA definition, which it should have done at the start, has actually distracted from quite an important debate about Labour doing something which I personally think is in Britain's national interest, which is taking a more muscular approach to Saudi Arabia and indeed to Israel in relation to the settlements in Palestine. And the problem with the row of anti-Semitism is that it, to the outside world, undermines the motives of those who are trying to take a more nuanced position than has traditionally been Britain's view towards the Middle East. And I think there is a really important need to go back to that debate and think about what we can do on a multilateral basis in regard to an arms embargo of Saudi Arabia and what we can do to ensure that the existing UN resolutions regarding Israel's activity are held to.
John, on the English question, can I ask you a query that I've always had as a policy nerd to somebody who was very prominent South Coast, South England, very South England. I remember once driving down the M3 with a Labour Scottish politician and pointing out to them that if they drew a triangle from Reading to Brighton and Reading down to Bournemouth, that triangle, if it included Guildford and most of Hampshire, would be one of the richest areas in the country. You can see the lights on the coast. And yet, they've never really spoken entirely with one voice, but they've also never spent a lot of time demanding money because it's dynamic. The joke now, of course, is that there are people in Guildford who are planning to launch into space from bits of the north of Scotland. But that's a very dynamic economy down there, even though there are very difficult pockets in Portsmouth and Southampton. Just talk a little bit about that bit of England, which I always think is neglected in the debate.
Well, the reality is, as somebody who part-time chairs a think tank for central southern England, the Southern Policy Centre, that actually the devolution of powers you need to local government to help you with your strategic economic development, your housing problems, balancing the questions of increasing population, inward migration, huge pressures on the environment, are just the same. Although, yes, in objective terms, these are much richer areas. Actually, when you look at people's incomes and their housing costs and their transport costs, I mean, it now costs £6,000 a year to go from my old constituency to London.
So disposable income is not
passengers on South West trains actually make a profit for the government, the only rail system where the passengers pay more than the entire cost of running their railway. So when you look at housing costs and things, the gaps in income are not quite as big as they look. But these areas need the same. See, I think you need government measures and much more investment into the north of England, into the East and West Midlands, into the West Country. I can completely understand the anger that Crossrail gets pushed through in London and the most minor electrification of railway lines in northern England gets suspended. This is outrageous. But nonetheless, in terms of shifting power out of London, there is much to be gained in central southern England as there is in the northeast of England. The question of a fair distribution of resources has then got to be grasped. And this is part of the problem of the current settlement. The Barnett formula gives a protection for Scotland, but the UK government does not protect the northeast of England or the northwest of England or Cornwall. And you actually need, as part of a reformed union, a commitment to a UK-wide fair financial system. And that is a debate that we have avoided for far too long.
But it is one where Joel Barnett himself said to a select committee that it was time for his own formula to be overturned.
Well, he only thought he was going to work for 2 years. It was a stopgap to get through to the 1987
John Denham
election.
and Will Straw, we're going into an interesting few weeks, and we'll see how strongly the issues you've highlighted come through. Thank you very much for taking part in Westminster Open Lens. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks.